The first thing I wanted to ask you both is, what has been the most surprising part of the Shaun Combs trial for you? Let's start with you, Anne.
I think a lot of the public reaction, even though I guess like broadly it hasn't surprised me, the sheer weirdness of it has been surprising. Yeah, like having AI Brad Pitt testifying at the trial is just, I don't think I could have conceived of that.
Wait, Brad Pitt testify?
He didn't, but there are AI recreations that people have made that
What?
make it look like that.
Okay, that is. I didn't have that on my bingo card.
Wow.
Helena, what's been the most? Try and top that. Try and top
No.
Brad Pitt.
I cannot. I almost want to say nothing has surprised me, which I know makes me sound super jaded and cynical, even when it comes to social media's reaction, as Anne was pointing out. I mean, some people are taking things extremely seriously, and some people absolutely are not. And every time I see it, I think, yeah, that kind of tracks.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Friday, June 20th. We've been covering the trial of music mogul Shaun Diddy Combs from inside of the courtroom most weeks. Today, we're going to talk about why this trial matters outside of the courtroom. And as a reminder, Combs is charged with racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty. If convicted, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. Today, I'm joined by culture reporter Helena Andrews-Dyer. Hey, Helena.
Hi, Elahe.
And we're also joined by style reporter Anne Brannigan. Hey, Anne.
Hey.
So we're going to talk about this master image maker, Shaun Combs, also known as Puff, Puff Daddy, Diddy, and how he's trying to manage that image now. And we'll also tackle the bigger societal questions this trial is raising about race in the justice system and consent in the aftermath of the Me Too movement. So first I wanted to start with you, Helena, because you are someone who's been following Shaun Combs throughout his career. You spoke with us at the beginning of this series of us covering the Diddy trial about how Shaun Combs is someone who's held a lot of power and importance, not just in the music industry, but also in other media, like in fashion. He started a high-end streetwear line, Sean John. We all remember Sean John. And he was at the center of celebrity culture because he also threw these huge parties and all kinds of people would attend. So going into this trial, how did you think he was going to try to shape the public image that was going out about him?
I would say he was so larger than life for so long, right? He literally was riding the top of the wave at peak hip hop, right?
So it was like in the 90s and
yes,
2000s.
90s, aughts, like the white furs, the dancing, the white parties, the over the top bling, like that is all Puffy. Like that is all, as I call him, Puffy, right? That was all
showing dating yourself.
I know,
in that
absolutely
regard.
dating myself. That was all sort of thanks to him and the image that he had created. We constantly say in the media that he was like a great Gatsby figure. He named himself that, right? And so I think it was clear to anyone watching that going into a trial like this that he would need to at least outwardly look quite humbled. All we're seeing is the court drawings and illustrations where he looks grayer, where he's like wearing a dad sweater, right? Like it's clear that he's trying to somewhat rehabilitate the way that we would see him so separately from how so many of us thought he was.
Like, we're not seeing the white fur Diddy. We're seeing...
He's not coming in there looking slick.
Right. Well, Anne, you've been at the courthouse. So how have you seen him show up inside the courtroom?
Well, yeah, like Helena said, he's been wearing, a limited assortment of these sweaters that look like you could have picked them up from Kohl's or TJ Maxx, right?
Which, no shade, but...
TJ Maxx all day.
Yeah, but it's like a far cry from the Diddy we knew before, right?
Right. And image-wise, if you just look at pictures, it looks quite different. But the demeanor really struck me, especially as the course of the trial has gone on. because he is somebody who's very engaged. Like, he's not sitting there, kind of performing in the typical ways we see a defendant perform. He's not sitting around looking contrite. He's like very active. He's constantly writing notes. He's constantly in his lawyer's ears. So even as there's like very disturbing testimony happening, he looks like somebody who's at work. With his lawyers, they really seem to defer to him in some really notable ways. He, fist bumps his lawyers, hugs his lawyers. So
he also got in trouble, right? Like for how he interacted with the jury.
Right. So he was looking at the jury and nodding his head really vigorously, right? And he was rebuked by the judge for that.
Helena, you kind of touched on this already. And I think it's important to just say, in case we forget, this trial is not being live streamed. The only way that we know what's going on inside of the courtroom is because of people like Anne and also other people who are not journalists at organizations like the Washington Post are there telling us what's going on there. So, Helena, for someone who's not there but paying very close attention to how the rest of, the culture and the media ecosystem, like how is what's happening there being perceived outside the courtroom?
Well, I would say a lot of what I'm seeing besides Anne's incredible reports is on Instagram, right? And whether that is like social media influencers who are getting into the court and then like reporting after, right? And kind of like summarizing, or those who are just like following live updates from a legitimate news organization and then like, summarizing it and digesting it for their own audiences through their perception of what's happening. I'm seeing a ton of that. Like it's been heavy on the Shade Room, right? You've seen
which is
the Shade Room, which is a very popular Instagram account,
like celebrity gossip stuff.
They've obviously been talking about the trial every single day and what's going on with it. And you see people trying to guess who's who and all that kind of stuff. And then you see the people who are commenting that they still think he's sort of being railroaded. Or you have people who are commenting, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is who this person may be, thousands of comments. It's absolutely what folks are talking about, I think.
And I mean, I have so many things I want to ask you, Anne, but just first of all, since you are there present at the courthouse, what does it look like to you when you are watching who is coming to watch this trial and report on it?
We have traditional media, a lot of CNN. There's us, of course, the Washington Post, the Times, AP, all the organizations that you think of when you think of, traditional news media. But there are also influencers, YouTubers, TikTokers, and even spatially, it's interesting how, like, within the world of the courthouse, they're also in two different very places. Like, they're very different in terms of what they're trying to give their audiences, but they're even separated out in these really notable ways. So, for example, where I sit is in the press room, and that's where all of these traditional media outlets, a lot of them are watching the trial, right? Whereas with your YouTubers, your influencers, they're watching from these overflow room, right? So we're not even sort of rubbing shoulder to shoulder necessarily as we're covering the same thing. And I think that spatial difference is just sort of mirrored in all of these other ways in terms of how differently these two sort of factions of media are approaching this trial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the way that this trial is being presented through these diverse media factions gets at this idea of the court of public opinion, how public opinion is being shaped about this trial. And obviously, Combs will be convicted based on 12 jurors or will be acquitted based on the opinion of 12 jurors, not what everyone else thinks. But let's be real, how much does public opinion matter in this trial? And what do you think?
So the jury is not supposed to be taking in or reading any media. This is not a sequestered jury, so, they have their phones on them. They have all the usual people around them. They're getting news alerts like the rest of us. But they've been very carefully instructed not to look at anything, right? So in theory, it should not matter. In reality, policing these things is difficult. So I think I see Combs with his team moving on two levels here. There's the case that they're presenting for the jury, but there's also the stuff that they want everybody else to know.
Helena, beyond whether public opinion will influence the actual outcome of this criminal prosecution, why does public opinion matter about this trial?
Public opinion matters because, let's say, and you have to use all the journalistic, hypothetically, allegedly, all of these things, that he gets off and he walks out of that courtroom. What is he going to do next? If you are, let's say, a alcohol brand, do you want Shaun Combs to be the face of it at this point? If you are a reality show, do you know what I mean?
And these are all business ventures he's been involved
already
in the
done,
past.
exactly. So if you are a clothing brand, if you are a cologne, like, it's hard to see him come back from something like this, just because so much has been said and so much has been out there that he has not denied, right? They don't deny the freak-offs. They don't deny that those were happening.
Yeah, like those are the sex parties involving male escorts and his girlfriends.
Exactly, and all of the baby oil plus the drugs. What do you do after that? His last album, which was the Love album, was, I think it sold 30K in the first week.
Is that
mostly
a lot?
streamed?
Sorry.
No, I mean, it's mostly stuff is streaming these days, but it wasn't some huge critical and or commercial success. And it was like his quote unquote return to music. So if that's not maybe available to him, and all these other streams may not be available to him, public opinion matters deeply, because then what's he going to do?
Well, and the other question I have is, I don't know if any of you listen to the radio.
No.
But I listen to maybe mostly grown folks radio, which is like music that was really popular in like the 80s, 90s, and early aughts. And even now you turn it on and it's like you can't go 30 minutes without hearing a song that was produced
exactly
by Shaun Combs or artists that became famous because of him. And so is he going to become such a pariah that beyond his ability to make money, other people, the rest of us, will people increasingly, if they haven't already, stop listening to him? Is his music not going to be played on the radio? And then that has downstream effects for how much money he can make. But also just like, as both Helena and Anne, how you both talked about in the first series of these conversations, his cultural impact, like, will there be a revisitation of the impact he's had on culture if he's convicted?
Right. And I want to also add here quickly that, the way that this trial is talked about is not just important for Combs, although it is, as we discussed, very important for him, but it's also really valuable for people who have survived, sexual assault. Because, and this is something that was brought up, by the prosecution, they're very aware that there's a lot of eyes on this trial. And the way that people have been talked about, the way that gossip sites and, certain personalities have tried to out women who are alleged victims of sex crimes and are testifying under court protection, all of that behavior is being clocked by people. All of that behavior is something that's sending a message to survivors of sexual assault about what it means to be believed and what could happen if they come forward.
After the break, we discuss what this trial says about the state of the Me Too movement. We'll be right back. Anne, you're bringing up kind of the heart of the case in some ways, which are these allegations of sexual misconduct, the transportation to engage in prostitution, and specifically the sex trafficking charge here. And I can't help but think about the broader social context that this trial is operating in, and specifically like how we even got here. So just as a reminder, Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, filed a lawsuit in 2023 making these allegations against Combs. And she was doing so because of a New York law that was passed during the height of the Me Too movement. And this law, it was called the Adult Survivors Act, and it gave people a 1-year window to file claims that otherwise would have been too old to sue over. And so because of this law, she was able to bring forward this lawsuit, and that lawsuit broke open a lot of these allegations which people had not heard of before. It opened the floodgates to many more lawsuits, and then now we are here with a federal prosecution. So when I think of this trial and what's happening, I can't help but think of the broader movement toward accountability that came in the Me Too movement. Helena, I don't know if you're thinking about this trial in that context, but what do you make of that? Is this trial happening because of Me Too?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's like no question that it is, right? But what becomes tricky, and I would love to hear, I know Anne has thoughts, is that it's almost, Me Too has also become somewhat of a pejorative in a way.
Explain that.
Like this idea that the Me Too movement is something that people have argued like, oh, maybe we swung the pendulum too far that way, right? Or everything get shoved into this Me Too bucket that might not be quote unquote Me Too. What is Me Too? You know, like once I was in a conversation with someone, they're like, oh, he got Me Too'd. You know what I mean? It's like literally if you use it so much, it is like, what does it mean? And is it just anything? Is it just, you know, something that somebody might say to you in office that you didn't like? Or is it sexual crimes? You know, like because it encompasses, I think, so much, it's almost hard for people to conceptualize. So then they start to frivolize it.
So let me ask you this, Helena, do you think we're in a moment actually now, like this trial is happening in some ways because of the reforms of the Me Too movement, like actual policy that was passed? But what is the status of the Me Too era right now?
I could not tell you, right? I honestly, like, what is the status of the Me Too era right now? There was a point where all of Hollywood, there was nothing that they wouldn't talk about. Now, who's at the forefront of that movement at this point, right?
Like, is there a backlash to it right now?
I don't know if there's a backlash to it. I don't know if, or was there a fatigue? And I'm not saying for me personally. Yeah. I'm just saying culturally, is there some type of fatigue? But to say that this is a Me Too trial, of course, I would absolutely say it is. But that doesn't mean that folks still understand sexual assault, sexual harassment, and any of those things in the type of context that they should, right? Because I think when it comes to the trial, especially because the defense's huge argument is that all this was consensual.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Me Too as a verb, because that's something I've been thinking about too. And the interesting thing that happens, I agree with you, it's used in this pejorative way that's a bit diminishing. Also, what happens when you use Me Too as a verb is it takes the substance of what's actually being alleged out of it, right? And it lumps everybody under this umbrella of accusation. And to your point, I do agree that there's fatigue and backlash. And one of the ways that we measure how we as a society are feeling about these things is actually through these celebrity trials. So coincidentally, you know, the Weinstein verdict could be seen as an indicator of that too, right? This is a retrial of, you know, this figure, Harvey Weinstein, who, you know, I think is a pivotal figure in the Me Too movement because he was the one who was accused by many people, including quite a few famous people, of sexual assault or sexual impropriety, right? He was recently tried in New York, not very far from where this trial is happening. And
retried, right?
Exactly, yes, retried, thank you. Retried for, you know, 3 counts affecting 3 different people, and he was only found guilty on 1. The other one, he was acquitted, and it was a mistrial on the 3rd. And so I think that definitely reflects a lot of, if not ambivalence, then just a lot of sort of confusion and sort of conflicting messages about where we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So are both of you viewing in some ways not only the way this trial plays out, like outside the courtroom, but also the eventual verdict, if there is one? You never know. Sometimes there's a hung jury. The outcome of this trial as one important data point to assess where we are at when it comes to the Me Too movement and everything it brought up.
I think it's definitely a barometer. I don't think we can say like, okay, if it swings one way or another, then it's like, oh, here's where we are when it comes to the Me Too movement. But I think it's definitely a barometer of how you talked about the court of public opinion specifically, how people are going to view where we are as a culture in that conversation. Because when it comes to why I brought up the whole thing of consent is that this trial and what he's accused of has brought up so many conversations between adults, right? People who would consider themselves evolved about what is consent and what isn't, and is this person being forced to do something or are they not? And how do you define that? And they are very tricky questions because I believe there are a certain subset of us. And I keep mentioning my age because, I am a grown-up, right? And have seen how things have evolved in the way that we talk about consent, right? It was a point where things were like extremely black and white. And then they became kind of gray. And then people don't know where they're supposed to stand. When I was in high school, we were still saying things like date rape, like no one says that now, right? And I think that as these conversations evolve and we see them on a grand scale, involving very famous people, everyone has to rethink how they think about these things and how they were taught these things.
Helena, 100% with you on the barometer. I was thinking about this as like it is a temperature check in a lot of ways. And to the point of consent, I think if you're talking about gray, we're talking about the grayest of the gray with this trial because we're talking about things that happened over the course of relationships, one of which was over 10 years, right? And so you have this jury of 12 people, 8 of whom are men, who will have to consider, questions such as, what does it mean to consent to one act but not to another? What does it mean to consent to sexual talk but not the actual sex act that you're describing in that talk? What does this look like if your alleged victim of sex trafficking is somebody who is being coerced by designer bags or trips to Turks and Caicos, right? How does all of that fit into our kind of notions of what sex trafficking looks like?
It's fascinating. Even before this trial started, Combs's team was trying to make this argument in public that race was a big factor in why and how he was being tried, that essentially Shaun Combs was being treated unfairly because he is a Black man and that white men have engaged in this sort of behavior and are not facing the same sort of consequences or treatment. Helena, that seems like a familiar argument in high-profile cases like this. I don't know if that's something that you were paying attention to.
Yes, absolutely. Because obviously, we're talking about O.J. or O.J. Simpson, Bill Cosby, R. Kelly, Black male, powerful figures, icons, not just in the Black community, but in the American cultural landscape, who've come afoul of the law. And obviously, as Black people of color in this country, there is a distrust of the legal institutions, right? There is a distrust of the system because we know it was not designed for minorities, right? It was designed to oppress in a lot of ways. So immediately, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to think like, oh, no, they didn't do this. Or they're trying to be, railroaded. Or, what did Clarence Thomas say is the high-tech lynching?
Yeah, and that's referencing the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who during his confirmation hearings was facing allegations of sexual harassment by Anita Hill.
Yes, exactly. And you have people who are like, oh, of course, because they want to support.
They want to support Combs, who they have this sort of personal relationship through his music.
Exactly. Not only that, you want to support someone who you think, one, you have this parasocial attachment to, again, that's thinking that you know a celebrity even though you do not. And the idea, this is someone who also achieved the American dream, right? Someone who didn't come from a lot of money, who wasn't wealthy, didn't have generational wealth, any of that, and then rose to the highest ranks of almost every industry he touched, right? And then you think, of course, somebody wants to drag that person down, especially if that person is a Black man in America. And then it goes back to the Mann Act, right? Specifically, they were using Jack Johnson as this example. You know, the first Black heavyweight world champion, boxing champion, was arrested in 1912 under the Mann Act for being with a white woman who he would eventually marry, not long after.
Right. So the Mann Act, it applies in this case because when we talk about transportation to engage in prostitution, that is the Mann Act. Like those things are the same thing. You know, that's the kind of charge that we're talking about. Now, historically, it's been applied in racist ways. I think objectively we can say that. Consider the fact that the Mann Act was also known as White Slave Traffic Act. So that gives away the game. That shows just how racialized these laws were. And I think that origin still, hangs above the application of it.
But when we're talking about these other high-profile men, I think one of the things that came up, at least when we were looking at R. Kelly and the accusations that were levied against him, and then also the eventual trial and prosecution and conviction that he faced, was that his victims were not just Black women, but Black girls. And that it's not, when we're talking about race, there's the race element, but there's also the race and gender and how it gets really messy from there too.
Yeah.
And inside the courtroom, I know we haven't gotten to the part of the trial where the defense is now fully able to present its case, but in their cross-examination, how have they hinted at, either implicitly or they've been very explicit, that they believe Combs is facing unfair treatment because he's a Black man?
So they were very upfront about this before we went to trial, but they have not been using it as a defense strategy during the trial, I think, for probably a number of reasons. Like, they're not saying it in court. They're happy to say it out of court or imply it in a lot of ways. So the way that race shows, it showed up from the very beginning. It shows up even as you just sort of look at the trial. You see Combs with his defense team of 8+ lawyers, and it's a pretty diverse team. Then you have the prosecution, which is mostly comprised of white women. The judge actually had to rebuke the defense at one point because Combs's longtime legal advisor, Mark Garagos, went on a TMZ podcast and referred to them as a six-pack of white women. And
yes, early on in this.
Yes,
I remember this.
Yes, and the judge had to be like, no, you cannot do that. So it's, from very early on, I think it's played this role, right? We saw it happen again this past week because we saw a juror dismissed, right? This juror was giving different answers about a very basic question, which is where he lives and with whom. And over the course of the trial, like from jury selection until now, he had given a few different variations of this answer that couldn't all be true at the same time. And also, according to the judge, kind of gave the impression that he was, quote, shading his answers to try to stay on the jury. Now, that's a big red flag. You do not want the juror who's angling to stay on the jury that, it suggests bias there, right? And so that's the reason why the judge decides that he's going to dismiss this juror. But the defense pushed back a lot on this because it was a Black male juror. And they accused the government at one point of a very thinly veiled attempt to try to get rid of a Black juror, but at the same time, also acknowledging that this is one of the most diverse juries they've ever seen.
Interesting. Well, yeah, and, it sounds like the defense is limited in its ability to be explicit about race inside of the courtroom, but this conversation about race is definitely a big thing happening outside of the courtroom. So this trial has gone on for many weeks, and now the government is expected to wrap up its case very soon. What are you both expecting to see, or what else are you looking out for? Let's start with you, Anne.
So something that came out this week is that the defense might not take a long time to call witnesses forward at all. They estimated, I think, between 2 and 5 days. If it's on the 2 side of that, that's pretty incredible because I think it might suggest that they feel pretty confident about their ability to introduce doubt here. Because remember, the defense doesn't have to prove anything. The prosecution has the burden of proof. The defense only needs to introduce a reasonable doubt.
Helena?
For me, it's funny because I've been going down like just deep rabbit holes on what Shaun Combs has been doing over the last like 5 years. And just the cynic in me has just been like, has this been just like a long campaign to like sort of like endear himself and reinvent himself, like when he changed his name to Love, the Love album. There's actually a song on this album. He talks about his soul kind of being messed up and how he's trying to like heal himself. The whole thing with the self-help books, apparently, that he has with him that people have spotted, and Anne would know about this. In the courtroom, I think as an observer, I feel like the defense is going to try to paint him as someone who absolutely did some things, right? Some bad things, but that one, those things weren't illegal, and two, he's trying to be better. And I think he's sort of been showing that outside the courtroom even before any of this came to light.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both so much for taking the time and having this conversation with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great to hear you, Helena.
Helena Andrews Dyer is a culture reporter for The Post. Anne Brannigan is a style reporter. Today's episode was produced by Sabby Robinson and mixed by Rennie Svirnovsky. It was edited by Rena Flores. Thanks to Carla Spardos. Our team includes Maggie Penman, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Emma Taukoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Renita Jablonski, Colby Ickowitz, and Martine Powers. Our intern is Tadeo Ruiz Sandoval. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.